I'm a big fan of the TV show Severance, which recently started airing its second season. It's got a creepy atmosphere, beguiling plot twists, and it also contains lots of symbolism, a tendency that applies no less to its soundtrack. So, as a music theory nerd, I thought that I'd take an in-depth look at the main musical theme of Severance from an advanced functional harmony perspective and see what mysteries I might uncover. It may seem limiting to only look at a TV show's main theme, but in Severance, this theme pops up everywhere. It uses a pretty simple harmonic motif, just 4 chords lasting 1 measure each, which makes it easy to incorporate into the show's incidental music. Throughout the series, these chords show up over and over again, often with different instrumentation and arrangement. If for some reason you haven't seen Severance, or if you just need a refresher on the music, I'd recommend that you check out Season 1's title sequence, which features this theme in its fullest form. It's also accompanied by some of the trippiest animation I've seen anywhere, absolutely full of creepy, surreal imagery, kind of reminiscent of a Cronenberg film, even. I'll put a link to that in the description. So what makes this theme so compelling? These chords are only simple triads, 2 of them minor and 2 of them major. It seems like the kind of thing that would be tiresome to hear after a while, but in reality the particular choice of chords has a mystifying sound which I find it's almost impossible to get sick of. Let's listen to them real quick. The most apparent aspect of the harmony here is that the chords don't all belong to the same diatonic key. This isn't too unusual in itself, plenty of music features non-diatonic chords, but here there's no immediately obvious functional pattern to the chords. The arrangement keeps C as a pedal point underneath all 4 chords, so it seems like we should treat the first chord, C minor, as the 1 chord, but that ends up giving us these functions, none of which comprise any especially common chord changes or have any clear analog to more typical functional harmony techniques. You might have noticed that the C minor and F major have the relatively more normal functions of 1 minor and 4 major. These are both diatonic to the C Dorian mode, or equivalently the key of B flat major, where the functions are the extremely common 2 minor and 5 major. This leaves behind the G flat major and A flat minor chords. But wait, you might notice that these 2 chords can fit into a diatonic key as well. Either G flat major, where they are the 1 major and 2 minor chords, or C flat major, where they are the 5 major and 6 minor chords. So, it's possible to interpret this chord progression as alternating between 2 distinct key centers, let's say C Dorian and G flat major. And if you think about it, this reflects the central premise of the show itself, the severance procedure pioneered by Lumen Industries. This technology splits a person's consciousness into 2 mutually exclusive parts, which don't share any memories and only one of which is awake at a time, just like in this chord progression where the 2 key centers don't share any chords. The chords from one key center don't make sense in the other, and vice versa. Understandably, the prospect of sharing your body with a whole other person creates a great deal of psychological turmoil for the show's main characters. Likewise, there's a sense of turmoil inside this chord progression. To begin with, while the sustained C pedal point harmonizes well with the 2 C Dorian chords, it forms a sharp dissonance with the other 2. Against the G flat major, it's a sharp 4 scale degree, which is not unthinkable as an upper extension, but when played in the bass, it sounds quite gnarly. And then the C also clashes against the A flat minor C flat, an impertinent sounding major 3rd scale degree underneath this minor chord. The difference in how these 2 sets of chords interact with this pedal point underscores the 2 key center interpretation and its intrinsic sense of conflict. Furthermore, since these key centers alternate with every chord, each individual chord change sounds quite angular. 2 of them are chromatic mediant changes, which are almost stereotypically creepy sounding, and 1 is a tritonal change, which is especially jarring, with the chord's root notes being as far away as possible on the chromatic circle of fifths. These kinds of chord changes highlight the tension involved in changing keys. Keep in mind though, it's certainly possible to modulate between these keys by using chord changes which de-emphasize this tension. It's something I'll have the opportunity to illustrate later on in the video. But for now, let's just say that the theme to Severance can be best thought of as maximally chromatic. In other words, it's composed in such a way to minimize diatonic relationships between adjacent chords. One of these chord changes is slightly less chromatic than the others though. The G flat major and F major can both be formed using notes from the B flat harmonic minor scale. Technically the scale isn't diatonic, but it's closely related to the diatonic B flat natural minor scale, and this flat 6 major to 5 major change is an extremely common trope in minor keys. In this case, it adds a nice familiar splash of vitality to this chord progression without really sacrificing much of its tense chromatic sound. With this in mind, the whole chord progression essentially starts to act like a story. We start on C minor, and minor chords are sad and dark, but at least initially this feels like our home key, a point of stability. Next we move to G flat major, a modulation whose tritonal relationship to the C minor makes it sound quite tense or unsteady. Then we reach the F major. Here we lock into the sound of that flat 6 major to 5 major change from the B-flat harmonic minor setting. The major quality of these two chords is pretty bright sounding, and the F major itself seems to propel us forward. The 5 major chord always wants to resolve to the 1 chord, which here would be just B-flat minor itself. But then we get an A-flat minor instead, a chord change which withholds any sense of resolution. Overall, these features create a series of distinct emotional beats. C minor is sad but steady, G-flat major is highly disoriented, F major is full of hope or motivation, and A-flat minor is unsatisfying or disappointing. This chord cycle symbolizes the struggles of the show's main characters, who face a similar repeated emotional cycle as they attempt to navigate the dystopian realities of the world they inhabit. There's a few other ways to interpret this progression, though. For instance, in the final chord change from A-flat minor back to C minor, both chords can be formed using notes from the C harmonic minor scale. Normally, in the key of C minor, the flat 6 chord is an A-flat major, so technically we'd need to spell this atypical A-flat minor chord with a B natural instead of the C flat you'd normally use. But this allows us to interpret the overall progression as using two different non-diatonic scales, the B-flat harmonic minor scale and the C harmonic minor scale respectively. Unlike the diatonic key centers, these harmonic minor scales apply to adjacent pairs of chords, but this still has a duality that echoes the show's main premise. Alternatively, for a lot of non-diatonic or atonal chord progressions, voice movement is the most salient feature, especially chromatic movement, since semitone intervals tend to grab our ear's attention. The voicings of these 4 chords have a lot of downward chromatic movements. In fact, if we start on the B-flat contained in the G-flat major chord, we can trace a long chromatic line downward, through the F of the F major chord occurring 1.5 cycles later. Because this chromatic line is 6 chords long, it overlaps with itself, creating what feels like a slow but never-ending downward slide. This matches the despairing tone of Severance in general, and it also could be symbolic of the location of the severed floors, that is, the severed workers' offices, which are all located deep in windowless basements. Of course, we still haven't even looked at the full arrangement of this theme, which includes a few piano melodies over these chords. The first melodic fragment sounds like this. As you might have suspected, these 3 notes cannot fit into either of the individual diatonic keys or either of the individual harmonic minor scales that we looked at earlier. In a way, it's like this melodic fragment is incompatible with itself, which seems to mirror some of the questions about identity that the show poses. As the arrangement develops further, another melody appears that is based on a repeated shape. The lowest note in each iteration of this shape largely follows the chromatic line I highlighted earlier, though the last note has to be moved to whole tone instead of semitone in order to line up with the A-flat minor chord. The upper notes of this shape, C and D, which remain constant, create an interesting recontextualization for some of these chords. They're diatonic in the C Dorian mode, of course, but they clash gravely against the G-flat major chord, essentially forming a tone cluster with that chord's D-flat. Against the A-flat minor, the C and D are only somewhat dissonant. In fact, they kind of support the C harmonic minor interpretation for this chord, with the C natural reaffirming that the A-flat's minor third is actually B natural. Overall, even though these melodies are fairly simple, hardly more than a few notes, they do a lot to complicate this theme's already intricate harmonic features. Now, in the beginning of this video, I mentioned how this theme is used by Severance's incidental music, and while watching Season 2, I noticed a few places where the music further develops the main theme's harmony. The first example is midway through Season 2, Episode 1, where, describing the scene as vaguely as possible to avoid spoilers, the characters are being led to some new, unexpected place. The soundtrack plays a few chords on piano. The first 4 are from the main theme, but then 3 more are added to the end. These new chords can be interpreted using the same patterns we've discovered so far, in particular the alternating diatonic keys. G minor fits into the C Dorian mode, and C flat major fits into the G flat major key, continuing the oscillating key center found in the main theme. This mirrors what the characters feel here, being strung along with more of the same dehumanizing corporate routine. The final chord diverges from these patterns. It's an augmented chord which itself has sort of an alien, unresolved sound, but more importantly cannot fit into a single diatonic key, a big question mark in this chord function chart. Once again, we're given the auditory equivalent of disappointment. Our patterns have led us to a sort of blind alley. And indeed, the scene that follows these chords seems to raise even more questions than it answers. Another example of the theme being modified is at the end of Season 2, Episode 5. Again, no spoilers, but if you're keeping up with the show, you probably remember this scene, where a few things are finally starting to be revealed. The scene's music reflects this with a slow variation on the theme's basic chord progression, sounding something like this. The theme starts in the key of D Dorian this time, not the C Dorian it normally uses. But it's still immediately recognizable as the theme, since the first two chords, D minor and A flat major, have the same functional relationship as C minor and G flat major. In other words, they've been transposed from C to D. But instead of proceeding to the usual third chord, which in D Dorian would be G major, it moves to F minor, remaining in the key of A flat major. This mediant chord movement, where the chords share two of their notes, is diatonic with a relatively comfortable sound. Next, the F minor moves to C sus4 and then C major, and if we consider things from A flat major's relative minor key, which is just F minor, then this is a simple 1 minor to 5 major progression. Again, the 5 major chord from the harmonic minor scale is an extremely common feature in minor keys, having a familiar, emotionally resonant sound. The transition is even smoother here due to the intervening C sus4 chord, which moves only one of the F minor's voices towards the C major chord before the other catches up. But most importantly, the C major chord is also diatonic in the key of D Dorian. And when we move back to our starting chord, we get the feeling that the whole string of connections between A flat major and D minor has a certain logic that we can follow. Even though the keys of D Dorian and A flat major are far apart, the relationships among the other chords form a sort of bridge between them, de-emphasizing the tension between these keys. This perfectly reflects the process of making sense of things that happens during the scene, and indeed in the next section the D minor chord converts to an optimistic D major. All of this excitement is short-lived, however. It's certainly progress, but only one step in the overall journey of the show. And the music that follows reflects this limitation, returning to the usual chord functions in the main theme, showing that even in this new paradigm, using D as a key center, we're still bound to get swept up into the same old conflict and confusion. And then, after a brief ambient interlude, the music repeats the usual chord function starting with C minor in the theme's original key, fully returning us to the character's usual bass line, at least for now. After all, the new chords in the beginning of this variation give us reason to hope. And in a show as bleak and dystopian as Severance, hope is a valuable thing. So, in light of the back and forth chromatic dissonance of the main theme, the fact that we're also shown a way to slowly dissolve these tensions in a more meaningful way is all the more powerful. This is an amazingly well-crafted show, and even though the music is just one aspect of it, it's an important factor in how the characters' experiences and feelings resonate with us, the audience. I'm excited to see how the show and its music develop throughout the rest of the season, and hopefully in future seasons too.